So, what's your first name?
My name is Eliza.
And how old are you?
I'm 24.
What did you major in college?
I did a sociology bachelor's with a minor in Spanish, and then also I got a paralegal certificate.
Terrific. And are you using that now?
Not currently. Not the paralegal certificate. I am currently working at Catalyst, which is a domestic violence agency, and so I'm using the sociology that way, and occasionally when there's no one else there that is more fluent in Spanish, I interact with people in Spanish.
Wonderful. Did you take a lot of women's studies classes?
I actually didn't, which is very odd. A lot of people that I did work with in college were surprised by that. I took the internship seminar class, and then I took Women in Contemporary Societies and a couple of other classes, but there's a lot of overlap between sociology and women's studies in both the professors and the course curriculum.
What did you hear is kind of the main repeated theme in classes that had to do with feminism? I mean, was it intersectionality, or what did you hear over and over?
I was very particular in the sense that I put a lot of planning into which professors I took, and so I took a lot of professors that I had a lot of values in common with, so the intersectionality piece was pretty predominant. I took a lot of classes with Nandi Crosby, and then I took classes with Molly Heck and things like that, so people who really were kind of in that third wave type of mentality, but also both and the other professors had a lot of respect for the fact that the reason that we got to this point came from the fact that all this other progress had happened first.
Kind of. I mean, it doesn't seem like it now that progress sure isn't linear.
That's true. Progress is cyclical.
Oh boy. So what other themes did you hear from Nandi and other professors besides intersectionality? What were they really trying to drive home in terms of thinking about feminism or women's studies or gender studies?
I think there's a lot of different elements to that, but I think the intersectionality is so broad that it's really hard to pick something that's completely independent. I think that a couple of the concepts that I've been working with, like in my brain recently, that come from those classes are looking at conflict theory. I think that there's still a lot that I look at in terms of Marxist theory and how it interrelates to the women's struggle. And then...
You mean in terms of class and economics?
And I think in the way that power structures are dependent on those, and how the power structures are kind of institutionalized and continue through class antagonisms and that type of thing. And then just like a very small piece that I still think about a lot is I've been doing work with standing up for racial justice. There's a new chapter forming in Chico and in Butte County, and that the phrase solidarity, not charity, and one of the readings that I did in the internship class with Molly about this group that was doing a health clinic in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, how that they really had to learn how to bring the people that they were serving in, and how to not have this like kind of top-down structure where they were this nonprofit that had the power and the resources that were helping this community that was going through an incredible struggle.
What do you see in terms of differences between second wave, third wave, maybe fourth wave feminists? Like sometimes there's a conflict. Like the second wavers say, "Oh, you people are just content to click on a petition and do clicktivism, and you are really concerned about wearing a t-shirt that says bitch and showing a lot of midriff, and you're not really doing the feminist organizing as a group in a way that's really assaults the patriarchy."
I think that there definitely is that conflict there. I think that it's can be really hard to kind of bridge that gap that I've obviously been coming from the later waves, trying to talk to people in the earlier waves, and it is difficult for some people to understand why certain things are trying to be reclaimed, or why there's elements of putting pop media people in roles saying that they are feminists, and
like Lena Dunham and Miley Cyrus.
Those two people I have problems with in terms of cultural appropriation and other stuff there, but I think people like Beyonce, that like a lot of people in my generation consider her to be a feminist, and a lot of people who are older don't necessarily do that because a lot of her money and power comes from sexualizing herself and having different types of things that people don't view her sources of empowerment as valid. And I do think that there are some elements that I agree with in terms of Bell Hooks' critique, in that there's something problematic about the fact that we are viewing her as powerful and empowered because she has power in the sense that it's power in the way that is defined by capitalism. But I don't think that I think that it is shaming and not useful to talk about how her sexuality plays into that, because I think that particularly because I think her standards of how her sexuality is critiqued is very specific to the fact that she's a black woman. So I think that there's different critiques there. I think that feminism, in terms of the type of organizing I've been involved with, are very focused on things like trans empowerment, and so I think a lot of people will get, a lot of feminists from the generation before me don't understand the focus on things like pronouns and a lot of the language that's been developed, and they really want to be able to participate without having to relearn all of this language that wasn't there when they were doing organizing.
Like cis or non-cis.
Yeah. And
do you believe that it's that important that we started the meeting for the Women's March with name and preferred pronoun?
Absolutely, because I think that it is just a minimal level of validation, and I think just because terms weren't super visible when 20 years ago or 10 years ago even doesn't mean that they aren't real experiences of people. And I think that the reason that it's in conversation now is because it is becoming more visible, because there are more people that feel comfortable identifying those ways. And I think that there's a certain level that I think it's really important to validate those people's experiences and have that just like basic level of respect, and recognize that it's really hard to come out halfway through a meeting and say, actually, could you please not use that pronoun for me? So I think there's that element. I also think that
have you run into that in meetings?
And even with the pronouns at the beginning, I've still had to correct people on pronouns during the meetings because human error, or because people don't prioritize it. So I think there's that level of human respect, and I also think that I really admire the work that non-binary folks are doing to challenge the gender binary and all the way that it interacts with patriarchy. And so I think that the non-binary community and a lot of elements of the trans community in general are working to dismantle that aspect. And
so that we could have a continuum rather than an either or.
And so I think that there is a lot of value in respecting that and prioritizing that, and putting in the extra work to learn the language.
So what do you say to the charge that second waivers are concerned about slut marches and slut shaming, and that it doesn't really address the basic social inequities and, women living in poverty, the lack of women in government positions, that kind of structural problems?
I think that it's not an either or question for me, that I think that the way that women's bodies are sexualized and the victim blaming and all of those things are interconnected into the class barriers that we face, and I think that it's interrelated to the violence that we face and all of those things. And so I think completely trying to disconnect them is not logical to me. But I absolutely understand that when you have lots of time and energy put into doing this very particular type of organizing that feels like it has very concrete demands and very concrete reasons and very concrete
outcomes,
oppression and outcomes and oppressions, that looking at something that is so much more subjective and so much more abstract and feels and I can see how it can feel counterintuitive. I can see how the slut marches seem counterintuitive to the idea that women's bodies are hypersexualized and that that's a problem. But I think that it is about recognizing that for a lot of women, their bodies are sexual aspects of themselves, and that the problem isn't that the sexuality exists, but the problem is how that sexuality is being interacted with and treated and projected onto them. And so that taking control of how that sexuality is portrayed is empowering. I think the real premise of that is to recognize that we can have this level of sexuality, but that doesn't mean that but that doesn't take away the importance of consent and elements like that.
How did you become a feminist? How old were you when you saw the light?
Well, I actually wore the shirt which says "Never underestimate the power of a woman," which is kind of small, but it's my mother's shirt from when she was in college. So I was really fortunate to have a mother who had a lot of those values, that she didn't raise me to be like, she never tried to encourage me to have be the mother of my dolls or to play house in particular ways. And so I think that she was very much responsive to whatever type of, so I think from little elements like that, it's been an accessible thing for me. My mother also has always had really strong female relationships growing up, and has very independent within our marriage and things like that. So I think that the modeling was done for me, but that a lot of my interactions with feminism in an academic way, or feminism as this structured paradigm, came about in college.
Why are you laughing?
I don't know. I think it feels weird because I don't really view that I have something in particular to say.
No, you have a lot to say. This is great. And then how did you become head of the GSEC, the Gender and what's the rest of it?
Gender and Sexuality Equity Center. And so since I moved to Chico, there is much more of an activist community here than in my hometown, which is in the Midwest.
Oh.
And so I got pretty involved in that pretty quickly, and that eventually led me through very different stages of activism, but that I started interning at the GSEC because it was in a stage of transition from being kind of a previous generation of the Women's Center to being the Gender and Sexuality Equity Center, which has much more of a queer and trans focus. And I really wanted to be a part of that transition, which was going on before me and is going on after me. And so I went from an intern for a year to the LGBTQ plus program coordinator for a year, and then I was the director for a year.
Did you use consensus decision making in your meetings? What kind of technology did you use as a leader, let's call it?
We definitely did not use formal consensus process. I don't think that anyone else had really had that formal kind of training on consensus, but that one of the first things that you're told as an intern is that we use a reverse hierarchical structure, and so that a lot of the programming decisions and various things are really made by leadership is in the interns. That like what speakers, the themes of events, all of that stuff is really formed by the interns, and that the coordinators are there to kind of facilitate that experience and do some of the coordination and behind the scenes work on that's required to have like one central person that is paid to be there for more hours a week than an intern is, and then the director is there to support the coordinators. And so that, not a formal consensus process, but it felt very organically consensus, that there were 2 hours a week staff meetings, and so all of the big decisions about the direction of the center came in those meetings, and I didn't really feel like I had a final say in decisions when I was director, and I don't think that I've seen other directors of the center model or lead that way in the years that I was involved, or this year when it's under wonderful new leadership. And
so you're still kind of involved with the center?
Not really. I just when you're doing this kind of work, you build up a lot of relationships with the people that you're doing the work with, and so I still have some of those relationships and have gone to several of the events, and I worked with the person who's currently the director for 2 years, and I have a lot of faith that she's not doing top-down leadership style.
Did you give Rachel advice when you were turning over the leadership and say, I think it's really important to watch out for da-da-da-da-da?
I think I told her some of the things that I personally struggled with as a leader in the organization, but that she had been involved in the organization for about as long as I had, and so...
What were some of the struggles?
We had some struggles in terms of the year that I was director. We were finishing the process of getting a trans program added to the center, and there were lots of hurdles in the way that bureaucratic organizations have, and there were a lot of struggles in people not necessarily understanding why we were prioritizing a group that is statistically a smaller percentage than other groups that we are serving, and things like that. And so that was a really long and difficult process. And
was it with the AS leadership, the Associated Students leadership, or who was the struggle with?
I think AS were the keepers of where the whole
money comes from.
That all of our money comes from them, and that in a lot of ways they're really not connected to the decision making of the organization, and so that when all of a sudden they are looped into this big decision, that the lack of context and understanding and knowledge of the everyday is really just a difficult process. And I think that AS is also really interesting in the sense that it is structured to put power in the hands of the students, and I think that is a really great value, and I think that a lot of other structures would compromise their ability to provide leadership in the face of conflict with the university administration, which I didn't personally see during the time that I was there, but I definitely have seen it on other campuses with their ASs. And so I think that it's a really great value, but I also think that they have a lot of turnover from year to year, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who are in positions of power within the government affairs really have any investment in GSUC. They don't necessarily have any really understanding of why it is that that work is important, and that communicating that within the bounds of the bureaucracy that's necessary to have such a large organization was very difficult, and it also, I think, made me question the directions I was taking as a leadership, and that part of my job became a much larger part of my job than previous directors, and so then it was difficult to balance all of the things, and just things like that. And also, when the director is the only person that doesn't normally supervise interns, and so to go from having really wonderful relationships with interns that are really close, and you're working with them every day, and you're having this like major hand in their development as an activist, and that's not true for everyone. A lot of people come in and are already seasoned activists, but a lot of people are coming in and they're first year students, so they've never really done this type of work, and so you're having this major hand in their growth as an activist and as a person, and then to go from that and then not having those relationships that are
It's kind of lonely.
naturally there was really difficult.
Yeah, right, that would be.
So not really, a lot of it wasn't even related to the activist work.
Right, which is typical in any large organization. People are in a debate about young people in this country. Are they Generation Me or we? Like Jean Twengey's a professor at San Diego State who says this generation is really self-centered, high rates of narcissism, anxious, depressed because of individualism and an emphasis on self-achievement and aggrandizement. And other people say, no, this is the generation that's altruistic. They volunteer. They care about issues because they know about global issues from the internet. From what you saw in terms of first-year students, which way would you kind of lean? Except yours is a bias because they were people who came to volunteer, but they got units for it.
Yeah, but there was an interview and application process, and for most of the semesters that I was there, it was pretty competitive, and so it really was a lot of people who were really invested in the values. I think that with every generation, there's a change in trend and values and all of those things, and that certainly my parents' generation went through a very similar thing with the kind of pushback from society and
the backlash.
Yeah, so I think that every generation faces some kind of backlash. I think that it's really unfair to categorize an entire generation as one way or the other way, and so I just don't really find most of those analyses useful. But I do think that there are, and I would say that most of the time when I was dealing with pushback in the work that I've done, that the pushback was coming from people who weren't millennials.
That were older.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also think there are things that are pretty unique to my generation, in the sense that the level of access to technology and what technology can do and all of those things. And so I think that selfie culture is new, but I don't think that it's bad, and I don't think that it's a sign of alienation. I think that selfie culture is really empowering for a lot of people, and I think that the internet has been this amazing tool in the sense that there are so many people who are from marginalized backgrounds that for one reason or another feel incredibly isolated in their geographic community, but that through the internet they're able to find these communities that really validate different parts of their identity, or really validate some of their values, or they're able to fit in a way that they weren't able to in their hometowns. And I think that a lot of the connections that millennials have on the internet or through those types of media are really undervalued.
Interesting. Because it gives them support and strength and knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that specifically two of the communities that I have really witnessed blossom on the internet is the disability community, whether it is through the ways that they're not able to access spaces in their own community because of their disability, or whether it is social stigma with disability, that there is a real effective isolation, and that being able to have a community that they can access 24 hours a day through online platforms is really valuable. Another community that I've seen really blossom is trans women of color, that being able to build friendships and support each other and recognize struggles and really develop the language that they want to use to talk about their own community has really been enabled through online organizing and online communities.
In the trans group at Chico State, like roughly how many people are active trans people?
It changes every semester because the interns change every semester, and the trans program definitely does not require people to be trans to be a part of it. So one semester I think we had 4 or 5 trans people out of 20, and then another semester it was much lower. So I think that that's really difficult to gauge, and I think that there are...
Is it most commonly women that, or is it not, there's not a gender majority?
The largest demographic in the GSUC is cisgender women, for sure. And then there are different cis men and non-binary folks that have been involved, and then trans men. And in the time that I was there were not trans women that were super involved, but I'm not sure that that's not true now. I think it's also true that trans women are the most vulnerable demographic, and so to really go out and do that level of public work, or to really be super out in a community as small as Chico or Chico State, is much more, like, has real implications in terms of danger. And so I think that there are barriers there that perhaps are affecting the representation, because I don't think that there are more trans men and non-binary people at Chico State. I think that that's just, though it's very possible that when we were trying to work on getting the trans program instituted, we frequently got the question, well, how many trans people are really here? And we can't really answer that, because we can look at the demographics of the general population, but those questions aren't really being tracked at Chico State in terms of demographics, and that being trans, and there's real barriers to accessing higher education, and so that I think it's possible that those barriers are higher I think it's very likely that those barriers are higher for trans women, and so I think it's possible that at Chico State there's more trans men that are out than trans women.
Interesting. To go back to how to get things done if you're trying to make change, it seems to me one of the hardest things is if you have people who talk a lot in meetings, and and they're happy to go on for hours, and it drives other people crazy. So just in terms of the practicality of how you be an effective change-making organization and include everybody but not get bogged down so that people say, I can't stand this. What have you found?
Well, in the activist communities that I've been a part of, there's always been a value, not all of them, but a majority of them, there's been this value of, I think it's called step up, step back. And so it's the idea that if you are someone that talks a lot or that you have a lot to share, that being mindful of the amount of space you're taking up and maybe stepping back. And then also if you are someone who tends to undervalue what they have to say or tends to speak very little, that recognizing the group has a lot to gain from those people stepping up and sharing more and really taking that leadership. And so I think that there's been conversations in various groups about that and trying and revisiting that when it's not necessarily being reflected in meetings. But
the quiet people aren't probably going to bring it up.
And that is partially why it's really helpful to have leaders who are really invested in that value so that they can do a lot of that accountability work, whether it's directly in the meeting or offline. That at the CSUC, the few times that really came up, there were such great relationships with the interns that having conversations with them outside of the meetings about it was pretty effective. I think that what the difficulties I've seen in that more have been in the groups that I've been a part of that have a lot more turnover. And so I did Food Not Bombs for 2 years, and that was really important and powerful work, and I'm glad that I did it. But one of the main difficulties was that there would be someone who would get involved for 2 or 3 weeks, and they would have as much say in the decision-making process as someone who had been involved for a year. And that a lot of times they would come in and not really understand the previous conversations that had happened, and so they would want to have a large space in the meeting in terms to either get caught up or to have the same conversation over again. And I don't know that we ever really came to a concrete solution to that. One of the things that Surge has thrown around as an idea, and that Surge Sacramento...
Why don't you define what Surge is, please?
The Standing Up for Racial Justice, and so it's a national organization that has different chapters, and their main goal is to organize white people to stand up for racial justice in their communities, and kind of specifically with the intent of working in solidarity with organizations led by people of color without kind of drowning out the work that those groups are doing, and take on the role of white people talking to white people, and which I think is incredibly valuable and needed. And so with Surge, one of the things that Surge Sacramento does, and I'm sure lots of other chapters do, is that they have started doing a half-an-hour orientation before the meeting starts.
For beginners.
To people that are newer, so that they can be caught up, like review the agenda and review the decision-making process and things like that. I've also been a part of other organizations that they recommend that people take a meeting to observe and then a meeting in the next meeting participate. That's really hard to enforce without being incredibly alienating to new people. So when you've been in this organization and the organization is, a lot of the leadership's getting burnt out, and because there's not enough sharing of the work, and then new people come and you want to make them feel like they are the star of everything. And that we are just so happy that they came, and so it's really difficult in those situations to say, actually, could you speak a little bit less? And I think that we're, as a social justice, loosely defined movement, still working on how to have those conversations.
Yeah, some people say, we're totally against hierarchy, we're against any kind of leadership that's not shared or whatever, and then other people point to that old classic article by Joe Freeman, The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Structure and hierarchy exists anyway, so you better acknowledge it. Where are you in terms of the role of leaders?
I think that I actually wish I had it, because Surge has a really great definition of what leadership is, which is basically to support and facilitate the group and not necessarily determine the direction of the group, but just to do some of the footwork with it. I'm not saying that's what Surge is, but that's, I think, vaguely what I remember. I also did Occupy Chico for a while, and that was a very big lesson to me in that leaderless movements still have leaders. It's just that they're not named, and so that people can become leaders by doing more work, taking on more responsibilities, or showing up more consistently. Or with Occupy, being at the camp more hours, that there's really natural and healthy ways that those leaders can develop, but it also can be leaders can develop by being more articulate or having more friends or
more time.
Yeah, and things like that aren't necessarily fair, and that can in fact reproduce the structures of power and oppression that we have in our more general society. And so my lesson from that was that it's really important to understand that leaders will somehow be there, and that really naming that leadership and having that role defined is really important in terms of accountability to the group.
So how would you, if you were called in to be a consultant to this group in Chico that's organizing a women's march in support of the DC march on January 21st, it's having a rough start. So if they were willing to say, you've done so much organizing, give us a little advice, well, how would you handle it?
Well, I definitely want to be sensitive to the fact that it's still developing, and so I don't want to say something that could alienate potential future collaborators. But I think that Megan definitely did a lot of one of my friends and other organizer, Megan, put a lot of energy into the last meeting of explaining what formal consensus process looks like and the values behind it and those types of things. And so I think that work was really important, and I think staying accountable to that process of formal consensus making, or just I go back and forth between whether the formal aspect is really necessary, but perhaps in this instance it is. But staying accountable to consensus decisions through a consensus process is very important. I think the other aspect that has been difficult for me to work through in this project is that there is a woman, or not a woman, but there's a group of people who started this, who were the catalyst for a lot of the movements that got us to this point. And I think that I am definitely respectful of that and want to show gratitude for that, but I think that what that meant was putting a lot of money into the permit process and things like that, and that when you feel like you've made the sacrifice of money and that your name is going to be associated with it formally and all of that, that there's a feeling of ownership that doesn't really work in the larger scheme of organizing for the liberation of women. And that isn't necessarily fair to other people who may not have been the catalyst for this event, but that have been the catalyst for a lot of other changes and organizing in this community. And so I think that power discrepancy is not, that one person is viewing as like they made the sacrifice of money, is not recognizing the fact that perhaps it's recreating power differences because this person could afford to put out that money. And so I think that one of the things I would recommend is to crowdsource to make this woman's financial contribution more equal to other people's financial contribution. And so then that does create more of an equal sacrifice and an equal investment, and really bringing out the best event that could happen. And I think we're all learning, and it's a learning process for everyone that is going to those meetings.
The thing that I think is difficult is that usually in a feminist group there's similar values. I see if you agree with this. I mean, we just take for granted that we believe in reproductive choice, and we don't need to debate that. And then in this group, it's a big issue. So it's kind of an unusual feminist, non-feminist, trying to work together activity.
And I think that is a question I have about the effectiveness of consensus process in this situation, because consensus process is all about relating it back to shared values and shared vision, and I don't know that necessarily there is that shared vision.
There isn't.
And I think that a lot of people, even the camp that's kind of like, of course, pro-choice, like what is organizing a women's centered event without a clear stance on.
And it's okay to say women's health center and Planned Parenthood. We don't have to go shh.
Yeah, I think that is definitely new to me in the struggle. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought.
So the question is, how do we use feminist organizing to deal with opposition like that? I mean, usually it's not so much an issue in a social movement effort, but in this case, it is. Because ordinarily they just wouldn't come, but the permit person got there before me.
I don't know. I'm really interested to see how this plays out. I think that I'm definitely empathetic to the idea that there are a lot of people on the fence, and that creating an event that is inclusive to those people, or not inclusive, but welcoming to those people, is important. I don't think that one reproductive justice speaker that's even associated with an agency is... I think that one of the visions that is for the event is to create this kind of healing space for different sides of the community to come together, and I think that that's really valuable. Mm-hmm. I think that for me it's really difficult because part of my healing process after this election does not include taking legal and safe access to abortion, all whether the good or bad abortions, taking that stance out of my organizing and out of my politics that I share with a communal group of people that I do work with, that's not part of my healing process.
Absolutely.
And so I'm really interested to see how it will play out.
It seems like what we've done is just pack it with people who are feminists, and it's just a numbers game almost. They just took over the meeting.
Yes.
by numbers and being organized. Mm-hmm. With an agenda.
And I really hope that is effective. I don't know. I have a lot of faith in the people that I do work with to make it through this and make this event the best possible that we can given the circumstances. And if this event doesn't work out, then at least I know that my community of people will keep going and it'll move beyond this event.
What do you think about forming some kind of Chico feminist coalition or something that is an organized network that continues after January 21st?
I think that is great. A lot of the stuff that I've done outside of the CSUC hasn't actually been explicitly feminist in any way, and so kind of the idea of doing community work under the umbrella of feminism is an intriguing idea to me, and I am not exactly sure how that'll play out, but I think if nothing else that this experience has really bonded me with a lot of feminists that I didn't know were out there,
Like you and me.
or that weren't, or that I didn't have that previous relationship with to the degree that I have it now. And so, whether it is a feminist, explicitly feminist coalition, or just the not so organized community of activists that I've been fostering the last 6 years, I'm really excited for that.
Good. One of the things that people say about your generation is they're really much more tolerant and accepting of diversity, ethnicity, gender, trans, whatever. Do you think that's because they're more people of color in your generation? It's a more diverse generation, or do you think it's an internet phenomena, or why is it that they're more egalitarian?
I think that even though progress is a cyclical thing, that there has been a pretty continuous development of progress through history, and so I think that every generation sees something that didn't really work with their parents' generation. And so I think that my parents' generation was in a much better place in terms of egalitarian values than their parents' generation. And so I think that part of it is my generation is growing up with all of these things that are considered so much more the norm, that like for a lot of people in my generation, being queer wasn't this big scandalous thing that everyone talked about, though I definitely recognize that there's a lot of people who had really horrible experiences in K through 12. And so I think that it is a product of the environment that we grew up in, and the product of the fact that this progress had already happened, and so, but the process is continuing of seeing the things that didn't work in your parents' generation, trying to do better. So I think that there's that. So I do think that my generation is much more tolerant as a whole. I also think that having a greater diversity in my generation in terms of racial and ethnic representation, in terms of gender identity, and all of those things is a piece of that. Mm-hmm. But I also don't want to dismiss the fact that there are people with very conservative views and values in my generation, that I found a really great bubble in schools, that I was able to find community and people that were really supported, and that I wasn't facing these everyday problems in the same way. But then I would take a class in business law versus sociology, and I would be blown away by some of the things that were just implicit givens to the class.
Like?
Oh God. They're like that reverse racism exists, and that
They're anti-affirmative action because they think poor white men.
Yeah. And
that in high schools.
Well, and that somehow calling someone a cracker is the equivalent of a racial slur, and is the equivalent of racial slur in the sense of like how it affects groups as a whole. I think it's very backwards. There were other things in terms of like women who faced unfair work conditions or were capable of just leaving and getting another job and things like that, or just basic capitalist principles of owning your own business so that you can profit off of the work of the people you supervise and things like that. That was a disconcerting experience for sure.
To change the subject back to food not bombs, what exactly does it do? It distributes food to people who need it.
Yeah, it works. It's an international organization, so there are hundreds of chapters, I assume. It's been a while since I've looked at their literature, but the general premise is that you take food that would otherwise go to waste or be discarded
From restaurants.
From stores,
Cafeterias.
all of those, like anywhere that you can get it, basically. And our chapter had a lot more success with local grocery stores and the farmers market, because in our nation there is this very superficial expectations of what good food looks like. And so there's lots of food that will never sell because it will not look pretty enough or something. And so we were really successful in getting a lot of food that would otherwise go to waste, that is produced out of the fact that capitalism, in order to sustain itself, must produce way more product than is actually needed, or way more product than the economy that individual people are capable of buying. And so what we would do is we would take that food and then we would cook it and then distribute it in the plaza to anyone that would want to eat. And it's really great in terms of just the visual representation of what the waste of our society can do to support when it's actually reaching the people that need it. So I think that there is a real political statement in that. The group was a lot of decision making was consensus based. There is a lot of anarchist leanings to the network of organizations, and so there's a lot of politics in that, but it also was just really, it sustained another aspect of what I want to do with the time that I'm putting into this type of work, because it was reaching a lot of people who for some reason or another aren't comfortable or aren't able to access other resources in our community. So people who don't necessarily feel compatible with a lot of the shelter type organizations, or other types of people that are giving out free meals, because it was just in the space that people live when they're living on the streets, and there were no barriers to accessing the food. And we used like real dishes and all of those things, and I think that there was a lot of appreciation in terms of the level of respect that our organization was able to show for people who are going through difficult times or are facing lots of other barriers in their life, and that, to be frank, a lot of people are just a couple of medical bills away from being in that position.
Yeah, or they run out at the end of the month. From the anarchists that you know, what I don't understand is who they think should be in charge of basic federal government services like defense or building interstate highways, or the kind of things that seem necessary to me.
I don't really know either. I think that anarchists are, that part of the nature of anarchism is that there's no real organization, and so that every anarchist I talk to has a very different idea about what anarchism is. So usually I just try to approach the conversation like with the understanding that whatever they're referring to when they say anarchism is something I will have to learn from them.
I get the emphasis on it has to be local, prefigurative kind of politics where we do locally what we want to see, because that's what we can control. So that makes sense to me.
I absolutely get that. And then I've also been friends with various Marxists who believe that a lot of the organization around society is through the production of goods within the economy, and that putting factories and other sources of producing products in the control of workers, that are working there really makes a lot of sense.
It's a growing movement, co-ops, worker-owned businesses.
And I think that there's a lot of value to that.
I had the treat to interview in Athens a member of a company that's worker-run. They took over after the management abandoned the factory, and it's totally worker-run. It's great. It's totally co-op.
There's several examples of that in Venezuela that are really cool to study.
Hundreds.
Yeah. Several
Yeah.
that I personally have studied. I'm sure that it's in Venezuela there's lots and lots of worker control.
What are you thinking about the impact of Trump on issues of equality and social justice, the issues that we care about? What's your prediction? What's going to happen at the end of 4 years?
I don't feel like I have enough information to make a prediction. I think that there is a lot of the rhetoric of his election campaign and a lot of the beliefs that I think were purposely intended to play to people's fears and purposely intended to play to the anti-intellectualism of working class white people. Or not that all working class white people are anti-intellectual, but
Those that are.
I think that there's some sentiments of that that are very apparent in a lot of working class white people, and so I think that a lot of that was a play for votes, and I'm not really sure what he will actually do once he's there, and
He probably doesn't know.
that is also the impression I get from the media.
Because he wasn't expecting to win. He was just going to get a lot of PR for his businesses.
But I do see the Bannon appointment, the appointment of the
Jeff Stephan, what's his name? The district attorney, the attorney general. He's really scary.
Yeah, and Pence is really scary. My mother and a large part of my community growing up were high school, public school teachers, and so I really think that the charter movement is very detrimental to equal quality across schools. And so the woman who was appointed to the Department of Education, she's very scary to me.
Very scary. She wants vouchers for private schools, and yeah.
And
Yeah, he says every position he's appointed is against that cabinet, that duty they're supposed to be. It's very weird. I think he's setting up like a reality show where they'll be fighting with their staff and each other and the generals and the billionaires and duke it out. It's like a big reality show.
I wish that that's what this was.
We could just turn it off.
So I have definite fears. I do think that there will be major losses and costs, in the sense that I think that American electoral politics go through cycles, and that a large part of the nation, one of the things that initially I found a lot of resonation with was the idea that we made it through Reagan, and we made it through all of these other horribly conservative presidents that really had what were essentially wars on the poor. And so I initially found a lot of resonation with that, but I also, with further reflection, yes, as a nation, general society, we did make it through Reagan, but a lot of people didn't make it through the AIDS epidemic under Reagan, and so I think that there will be equal costs in that way. Not that exact way, obvious.
Right.
But
yeah, but people will be hurt, like dreamers.
yes.
anything else that you'd like to add about your generation's activism, young feminists? Is there a fourth wave, or are you thinking third wave?
I don't know. I think that for me, a lot of the waves have been, other than the declaration of the third wave is here, that most of the waves have been defined in retrospect. And so I have trouble putting what I see going on now in those terms, but I do think that we as women have not really come close to what I would call political, economic, or social equality, and that there will continue to be women fighting that.